bears are marine mammals that are one of the largest land carnivores in the world. They are the youngest species of bears and are most closely related to brown bears and grizzly bears. Polar bears are considered circumpolar species and spend much of their time in the Arctic sea ice. They also sit at the top of the food chain in the biologically rich Arctic Sea. Polar bears normally live 20 to 30 years and mature around the age of 4 and 5. Globally, there are roughly 20,000 to 25,000 individuals in 19 subpopulations. However, they are unevenly distributed around the world and they have location dependency on prey availability. They primarily depend on the fat of ice-dependent seals. On land, they can catch reindeer, young and eggs of seabirds and geese, and whale carcasses that have washed ashore. By diving, they can also eat berries, grass, and seaweed. Overall, polar bears are vital to the Arctic ecosystems.
People native to the Arctic or people working within the Arctic communities will be affected if polar bears have to migrate due to habitat destruction. Hunters and industrial developers are also at stake if polar bear numbers continue to decrease.
Many problems are affecting and destroying the habitat and lifestyle of polar bears in the Arctic. Global warming is causing a melting of ice in the Arctic that polar bears live and hunt on. A loss of ice also means that there will be less prey for polar bears such as seals. Therefore, polar bears will have to swim further to hunt and use more energy for less food, because loss of ice also means less prey. Because of lack of food and habitat, the polar bear population is declining. Lack of food causes starvation and death. Also, the average survival rate for cubs at 1 year is 65 and at 2 years is about 85%. This means most polar bears die before they're even 2 years old. This declining population leads to an unbalanced ecosystem. Polar bears are at the top of the food chain, so a lack of polar bears will disrupt all organisms below them in the food chain.
Indicator species are vital to the Arctic since they serve as a sign for the overall health of the ecosystems. Since polar bears are considered indicator species, the decrease in their population can betray the imbalance in the ecosystem. Without the presence of polar bears, it would be harder to determine how and when the ecosystem is affected. Another issue is that the decrease in polar bear population decreases biodiversity of the Arctic area. Biodiversity is important because it is considered one of the 4 main principles of sustainability. As a possible solution, moving polar bears to other locations can cause external environmental and ecosystem problems. Food chains can be disrupted because the entrance of polar bears means additional consumption of other resources that may be vital to other organisms. As mentioned before, polar bears sit at the top of the marine food chain, and the loss of polar bear populations will lead to increased number of prey, therefore further disrupting the food chain. The remains of the seals from polar bears' eating habits are essential sources of nutrients for other Arctic life species. Additionally, organisms that are usually dependent on seal remains will begin to turn to vegetation for food sources, which is already scarce in the Arctic. This would further deplete the already limited amount of food sources that are available to herbivores in the Arctic region. If we were to move them, they would take up more space in the relocation areas.
If we deplete our polar bear populations for quick profit first schemes, the initial outcome may seem great. However, it is more beneficial to us if we preserve these populations for the future. These resources polar bears provide will be worth much more later on. If we do not take action now in preventing further depletion of these dwindling population numbers, fixing this problem in the food chain that these creatures play a significant role in will become increasingly more expensive. Additionally, polar bears play a role in the tourism industry. Without these magnificent creatures, the industry is sure to decline. Because of habitat desolation, polar bears are having to migrate south in hopes to survive. They travel south because the ice caps that are melting and breaking down float southward. However, polar bears are unable to survive in these warmer conditions, but unknowingly follow the ice. Along their journeys, they look for new places to hunt for food resources. Generally, they will find these at camps and villages. This is where human-polar bear interactions may occur and can be potentially extremely dangerous. As summer ice retreats, industrialists obtain more opportunities to develop and expand their businesses on both land and sea. Issues between polar bears and industrial industries could potentially arise because the bears are spending more time on land.
There are many ways that we can take steps towards solving that issue. For example, the Fish and Wildlife Service advocates that the single most important action for the recovery of polar bears is global reduction of atmospheric greenhouse gases. Cutting our greenhouse gas emissions would reduce climate change and start to eliminate the primary threat to polar bears. We could do this by being more energy efficient and reducing, reusing, and recycling products. Using renewable energy resources such as solar energy would help as well. Scientists say that with this approach, greenhouse gas emissions would peak around 2040 and decline through 2080 and then through the end of the century. For this to happen, are reductions that would have to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius above industrial or pre-industrial levels. Though this approach would take several decades, it deals with the most serious causes of the polar bear's population decline: sea ice loss and the decline of marine prey. It would still cause an overall decline in polar bear population, but it would be still more affecting than managing other threats.
We could also feed and manage the polar bear populations in the locations where they currently reside. By providing winter supplemental feedings throughout the Arctic, we would reduce bear malnourishment. This would improve polar bear reproduction rates, lower their susceptibility to diseases, and boost their overall health. This solution would also help to maintain the tourism industry. However, this would be a very expensive process. It has many unintended consequences as well. Polar bears could become too dependent on these supplements and alter their natural living patterns to take advantage of them. If we ever were to stop feeding the bears, we could potentially contribute to large-scale die-offs. More importantly, this process may generate so much carbon dioxide that the solution would not work out in the long run. Another potential solution would be to take in polar bears at existing zoos and design new zoos for them as well. Zoo personnel are well educated in small population management and would be able to manage some genetic diversity in the bears. The bears would be treated with expert help and would likely live longer in captivity. We could use this method as an opportunity to learn more about the bears too. The downside to this technique would be that if environmental conditions became suitable for polar bears again, it would be hard to return them to the wild, since they would have problems readjusting to their new environments. The process would be expensive, and they would only be effective if we also take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Otherwise, we could still lose all of the bears by the end of the century. Relocating polar bears to the Antarctic is another option for saving polar bears because sea ice is expected to remain in the area for a very long time. With enough sea ice, the bears would be able to hunt for enough food again. Over time, however, this could be very harmful to both the bears and the native species if they have to compete with each other for resources. Keeping polar bear populations distant from native species could prevent any harmful interactions between them, but most scientists do not think of this approach as a viable option. Environmentalists have been working hard to solve the polar bear crisis. The World Wildlife Fund advocates for governments to recognize and mitigate the effects of climate change on polar bears. They have successfully made a formal statement that recognizes the need for a global response. In addition, the organization is supporting community projects to reduce the danger of human-polar bear interactions. They are promoting better fencing, better lighting, warning plans for when bears enter, and safe bear deterrence methods such as using pepper spray. On July 2, 2015, the Fish and Wildlife Service announced a Polar Bear Conservation Management Plan. It is a 5-year, $13 million plan which identifies how we can best help to sustain the bears. This U.S. plan focuses mainly on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also includes goals for improving human-bear interactions and other issues. This plan will guide us in managing the polar bear population and will hopefully be incorporated into international conservation efforts.
The best and most practical way that we can recommend to solve the polar bear crisis is to cut greenhouse gas emissions. This will immediately help to slow global warming and therefore slow the melting of Arctic ice. We can cut greenhouse gas emissions by reducing fossil fuel use and improving fuel efficiency. This can be done by putting harsher restrictions on burning fossil fuels and establishing standards for fuel efficiency. Anyone can help by voting for politicians and officials who are passionate about helping solve the problem of global warming, carpooling, and using less energy in your home. This includes driving less, using less heat or AC, and using less electricity. Another way that you can help the polar bear crisis is by adopting a polar bear and donating to the cause. This supports the WWF, who are working to help species who are vulnerable to extinction, such as polar bears. They would use these funds to monitor bears, fund researchers, and understand the impacts of climate change. These are just a few ways you can get help and get involved in solving the polar bear crisis. So please, get out there and help.
Okay, I'm not ready.
Indicator species are vital to the Arctic.
Hey, can you do me a favor? With your finger, can you like...
Yo!
Yeah.
This includes driving less, using less heat or AC, using less electricity, and
Arctic, we would reduce polar bear malnourishment. This would improve polar bear reproduction rates, lower their susceptibility to oh my god.
No.